Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
I appreciate all the hardy souls who managed to make it out of their homes after all of our inclement weather of late. Boldly you go forth back into normal life today. I don't feel quite so bad when it's me that's providing a program and we have a light turnouts. When I invite other people who have to come some distance, that it can be a little embarrassing. But as most of you have found out about me by now, I'm beyond embarrassment. So it has occurred to me over the past year that I've been here at the museum that there's been any number of stories of local folks that I have reacquainted myself with or became aware of that, given the tenor of modern times, might prove very instructive for us to resurrect and remember. Particularly the stories of outsiders who come into our midst with a different background, beliefs, who somehow or another can overcome those sometimes very significant obstacles and become very beloved and valued members of our community. And such was the story of the man that we're going to talk about today, Clinton Albert Cilley. Now, young Mr. Cilley was born in New Hampshire. And I'm going to have quite a time reaching everything here without blocking something, I'm sure. But he was born, as you can see, in 1837 in New Hampshire. Pretty good ways from dear old Lenoir, wouldn't you agree? And he was the son of a Free Will Baptist minister whose beliefs back then, the Free Will Baptists, were distinguished by the fact that they were not adherents to the concept of predestination. The Cilley family very much valued education and were very proud of the civic accomplishments of that family and the service that they had gave to their native state of New Hampshire and the nation. As you can see, Clinton's paternal grandmother was the sister of a New Hampshire governor, and his great-grandfather was a general during the Revolutionary War. Young Cilley attended Latin day schools in his hometown in New Hampshire, and then was accepted and attended Harvard University. Now, back then it was referred to as Harvard College. And this is a photograph of young Clinton Cilley when he graduated from Harvard in 1859. Now, of course, as we all know, the end of the 1850s and the advent of the 1860s would end up being a very tumultuous decade for our nation. And young Clinton Cilley would be caught up in that. After his graduation at Harvard, he decided that he would go into the field of teaching and move to western Minnesota. Now, at that time, Minnesota was considered part of the western frontier. And in fact, unlike us here in western North Carolina, the folks living in Minnesota were still dealing with Indian uprisings and raids, and it was a very precarious place to find oneself living in the late 1850s. He taught what we would now consider high school level students in Minnesota and was one of the earliest such teachers in that state, in that portion of the state anyhow. Now, let's see if I can... When the war breaks out in 1861, many of his students are of military age, and they think so much of their teacher that they encourage him to volunteer for service in the Union Army so that they can serve under him now as an Army officer and not just their teacher. Cilley, much to his credit, turned down an offer for a commission in the Union Army from his native state of New Hampshire. He also turned down a similar offer as a commissioned officer from the governor of Minnesota. And he stated to his father, who would become a chaplain in the Union Army himself, that I want to learn the soldier's trade from the beneath up. A highly commendable attitude. And he actually enters the Army as a private, but of course due to his education and the esteem that so many people in that area of Minnesota had for him, he quickly did in fact become an officer and captain of Company C of the 2nd Regiment Minnesota Infantry. Now, as the war progressed, it became very apparent that young Cilley was quite a bold, adventurous, and brave young man. At the Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia on September 19th of 1863, he was thrust into a very embarrassing situation for the Union Army. The overall Union commander, Franz Rosecrans, ill-advisedly ordered one of his divisions to move out of its position in line to a different position, which created a large gap in the Union line, which the Confederate troops exploited and charged through. Cilley was able to see what was actually occurring on the ground and rode forward and was able to save a Union artillery battery from capture, having his horse shot out from under him. The battle continued into a second day on September 20th of 1863, and on that day his actions would later see him receive the Congressional Medal of Honor for a rather unique action that he was involved in. The Union Army was in retreat on the second day of the battle and was trying to find a defensible position to cover its retreat to Chattanooga, Tennessee. The Confederates hot on their heels. The 2nd Minnesota was in the midst of this fighting, and young Captain Cilley, seeing that his regiment was faltering, rode forward, again having this time actually 2 horses shot out from under him, physically grabbed a Confederate flag from a Confederate flag bearer, raised it aloft, rode back to his regiment, and rallied his own regiment, not with the colors of the United States, but with the captured Confederate flag, and led them forward, buying the Union Army sufficient time to consolidate a position on Snodgrass Hill, where they were in fact able to delay General Bragg's Confederate Army for enough time to retreat in a more orderly fashion to Chattanooga. Now, he received this Medal of Honor after the war, when the members of his regiment petitioned Congress specifically for that action, that it was worthy of receiving the Medal of Honor. Now, the injuries that young Cilley received on that day at Chickamauga, with the horse falling on him, injured his left knee, and it would be a physical disability that he would suffer great pain for the remainder of his days. And that subject will come up a little bit later in our presentation here. Now, recollect the picture you saw of young Clinton Cilley as a graduate from Harvard University in 1859. A few short years later, less than a decade, look at the marked change in this young man. The toll that war had taken on him, and undoubtedly the toll that daily and constant pain from his injuries had given him. Now, this is probably the way Clinton Cilley appeared when he took over the Freedmen's Bureau for the Western District of North Carolina in 1866. The Freedmen's Bureau was formed right before the close of the Civil War by the United States Congress to ensure the rights of the newly freed slaves in the South, to make sure they had the opportunity to vote, to make sure that they were treated fairly and paid fairly for their labors after the war. And Cilley was appointed to be the administrator for all of western North Carolina for that newly founded federal bureaucracy. A pretty heavy responsibility in a time when there was great stress and strain on the social fabric of the South and our nation as a whole. Apparently, unlike some administrators in the Freedmen's Bureau, his conduct during his tenure was deemed not only by his superiors and the United States Congress, who investigated the Bureau after the war, as well as the Southerners that he was overseeing, as being a very fair and generous man. A label not applied very frequently to folks in that position. Now, in his capacity as administrator for the Western District of North Carolina, he operated out of Salisbury, North Carolina. And part of his territory was Caldwell County, and he was involved in a number of cases in this area, which again attracted the attention of local folks here for his perceived fairness and even-handed treatment of both black and whites. He served in that capacity for about a year, and while doing so and conducting some cases here locally, he met the acquaintance of a gentleman by the name of George Nathaniel Folk. Now, Colonel Folk was a Confederate soldier from this area. He actually born in Watauga County, but before the war had been an attorney in the area, and during the war would rise to be colonel of the 6th Regiment North Carolina Cavalry. And once again, in one of those ironies that history so often presents us with, Colonel Folk was on the opposite side of the field from Colonel Cilley during the Battle of Chickamauga, Georgia in 1863. Now, these gentlemen became fast friends. At the time, Folk was operating a law school here in Lenoir in a home, Cherry Hill, which still stands, barely I might add, it still stands, up off North Main Street here in Lenoir. I fear, unless it falls into friendly hands soon, it may not be there much longer. But Colonel Folk operated out of his home a law school that brought about some of the most early and prominent legal minds from Caldwell County. And he and Colonel Cilley, although they had been opposites and perceived enemies during war, now became the closest of friends. And Colonel Folk would be brought up on charges of war atrocities. He had been ordered during the war to execute a Union sympathizer down in Randolph County, North Carolina, in the Asheboro area. And that man's family and some of the more vindictive politicians during the Reconstruction era decided that they would use Colonel Folk as an example and perhaps even prosecute him for murder and war crimes. Colonel Cilley decided that he would intervene on his friend's behalf, and he successfully did so. And it surprised any number of people locally, particularly, that this New Hampshire / Minnesota boy, Yankee colonel, grabber of the Confederate flag, would actually defend a Southern soldier so aptly and so well. And of course, this cemented the bonds between Cilley and Colonel Folk. In fact, Colonel Folk was the first owner and occupant of the house, Cherry Hill. And he too operated a law school out of that home while he occupied it. And in the mid-1870s, when Colonel Folk decided he needed larger quarters, he sold Cherry Hill to Colonel Cilley and moved out to Happy Valley and resided in a home out there, which some of you folks might be familiar with, called Riverside, the home of the Fraser family, which is still out there in a lot better shape than Cherry Hill is, I might add. Still occupied as a dwelling. Yeah, I think we covered that ground there. Now, this is an image of Clinton Cilley as he would have appeared while he was here in Lenoir, serving in the capacity as mayor and as a Superior Court judge. When Cilley resigned from the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866, he consulted with his friend George Folk, who of course was a lawyer, and determined that perhaps his best future course would be in the South rather than returning to the North, and that he would pursue the study of law himself, and studied under his friend George Folk. And in record time, within a year, he had passed the bar in North Carolina and became a practicing attorney here in Lenoir. And while he was studying law, of course, he had to support himself, so he would serve as postmaster here in Lenoir, also as the registrar of voters here in Caldwell County while he was pursuing his legal studies. And in the time of his arrival here in Lenoir, still being relatively young and a single man, he fell in love with a local gal by the name of Emma Harper, the oldest daughter of James C. Harper, who is, of course, as you all are aware, a very prominent local family. Now, Emma's father, James C., had been a rather ardent Confederate during the war and wasn't exactly thrilled by the notion of his daughter, as James Harper said, courting a damn Yankee. But young love being what it is, the two persisted. And Clinton Cilley determined that his best course of overcoming his, he hoped, future father-in-law's objections was to make a name for himself here in his adopted hometown. And he had become well known, even by this time, by his activities and the civic positions that he had held. He was an Episcopalian by faith and became a member of St. James Episcopal, right down at the bottom of the hill here from the museum. Became a very integral member of that congregation. In fact, was known, according to their records, to have conducted the services at the church from time to time when the church's rector was either ill or away on other duties. And he and another lady I've talked about previously here at the museum, Laura Norwood, were very instrumental in also starting the Pioneer Library here in Lenoir, which would be the first circulating library in this part of North Carolina. He and a number of other prominent local folks were very active in a number of literary clubs, the Vespers Reading Club, which was an outgrowth of the Pioneer Library actually was an outgrowth of the Vespers Reading Club. But he wormed his way into the hearts of local folks very effectively. And in 1867 would be elected mayor of Lenoir, a very unlikely man to be the first head of the government in Lenoir to be called mayor. This young northern boy, who was once an enemy to so many people in war in this area, had won them over. And when he became mayor, James C. Harper's objections evaporated. And he and Emma would marry and live together for a long and happy life. Now, when I say that Clinton Cilley became the first mayor of Lenoir, that requires some clarification. He is the first man to hold the title of mayor in Lenoir. There had been two previous gentlemen who were considered to be chairman of the town commissioners. Edward Fawcett, who was an educator, the head of the Findlay Academy, prominent local Presbyterian, who was actually the first chairman of the town commission. And he was followed by George Washington Finley Harper, who was the second chairman of the town commissioners. And this chairman role was essentially and effectively the position of mayor at that time, just did not utilize that title. But when Cilley is in that position, he's the first to be called mayor of Lenoir. That right, Mayor? All right. Well, a little fact checking in the back row back there. Yeah. Getting ahead of myself in my slides here, I guess. Now, Cilley would serve as the mayor. At that time, the mayor served a term of 1 year, and he would serve. How long have you been mayor now, Joe?
I'm in my second term.
All right, and those terms now are what?
4 years.
4 years. No wonder we're talking about term limits so much anymore. We go back to Cilley's time, you just had the job for a year. But he would serve for 4 terms as mayor, and would serve in that capacity until he's appointed to fill the vacancy of a superior judgeship down in Davidson County, which he accepted, and left this area temporarily to handle those duties. But Folk, and of course his wife Emma, with their roots here locally, was always looking for the opportunity to return to Lenoir. And by the 1870s, they were back in this area. And again, a vacant judgeship here locally came up, to which he was appointed to as well. In fact, that judgeship that he served in locally is one and the same that subsequently, down many decades later, our own Judge Beverly Beal served as here in this county as well on the Superior Court bench. Now, Clinton Cilley's war wound continued to plague him greatly. In fact, by the 1880s, he was pretty lame and was having a very difficult time getting around. And in fact, the problem must have come along much earlier than that, because in the collection of the museum here is a hand-carved cane, and in spiral writing around the cane, it reads, "Presented to C.A. Cilley by J.L. Lenoir, Lenoir, North Carolina, July of 1868. It's a beautiful piece of hand workmanship that I'll happily allow to be passed around so that you folks can take a look at it. In the last decade and a half of Clinton Cilley's life, and this is the last known photograph of him, the duties of his judgeship and the district that he was covering required his move to Hickory, North Carolina, of course just south of here. And there is where he would live and die the last decade and a half or so of his life. This slide here, I believe I've already discussed most of the information on it, but when he passed away in 1900, he was buried in Hickory at that city's municipal cemetery, Oakwood Cemetery, and as you can see, his gravestone reads Clinton Albert Cilley, Medal of Honor, Colonel, U.S. Volunteers, Civil War, February 16th, 1837 to May 9th, 1900. I fear that Clinton Cilley's story, as have been any number of other stories of local individuals, are dimming as time goes by. But had it not been for men like Clinton Cilley, certainly Lenoir, Caldwell County, and this area of North Carolina would not have progressed particularly as well as they did in the aftermath of the Civil War, which devastated the economy of this country. I'll be severely chastised again by our honorable mayor back here if I failed to mention the fact that one of Clinton Cilley's other notable local accomplishments here in this area was his attachment and membership with the Masonic Order. The High Brighton Lodge had been formed right before he came to Lenoir. And I think, you correct me again, Mayor, if I'm wrong, but the first head of the lodge, Samuel Finley Patterson, had progressed in the Masonic Order at that point where he was Grand Master of the state of North Carolina, I think, Patterson was. And it was sometime in that time frame that Clinton Cilley would become the Grand Master of the High Brighton Lodge as well, and was very instrumental in seeing the order through rocky times as well. And that
He was actually the first master of the lodge here.
Okay.
It was formed in 1866.
Right.
The other, Patterson, had been the master before the lodge opened here in the north. They were part of Wilkes County
Gotcha.
Order at that time. And the first lodge opened here in 66, 67. And C.A. Cilley was the first master of the lodge here.
I knew you'd keep me on the straight and narrow there, sir. Of course, our current mayor is a very proud member of the High Brighton Lodge himself, and has no doubt been inspired a time or two by Clinton Cilley's story as well. But at any rate, that's the story of Clinton Cilley. I appreciate you folks joining with me and remembering him today. And Linda, I believe you have a question?
In your research, have you ever found why he was buried in Hickory rather than in Lenoir?
Well, he had moved to Hickory about 10 years before his death because of the duties of the judgeship that he was holding. It was a multi-county district, and apparently there was a lot more wrongdoing going on down there in Catawba County than up here. So his duties required him to be in court more in that area, and I think that's probably what prompted him to move to Hickory more than any other reason. I know, in having reviewed his diary a little bit, that it was a tough sell for him to convince his wife Emma to leave Lenoir, to go to Hickory. But she resides beside him there in the cemetery in Oakwood. Yes, Judy?
Did they have children?
They did, and you know, even the most successful lives have tragedy in them. They had 3 children, 2 of which did not survive to be adults, which grieved Colonel Cilley and his wife considerably as well. One daughter did survive and brought continued credit to the Cilley family name by serving in several prominent civic positions in Catawba County, and there still are descendants of Clinton Cilley in Catawba County. The museum down in Newton has a considerable number of Colonel Cilley's artifacts and manuscripts in their holdings as well. Anybody else have anything they'd like to ask?
Where is Cherry Hill?
Cherry Hill's right up off of North Main Street, near the intersection of Finley Avenue. It's on the hill on the left. It's your traffic light there at North Main and Finley. This time of year, you might actually be able to see the backside of the house with the foliage down. But the house actually faces a yes.
It was the home of Jack and Ruth Walsh,
Okay.
who operated the mill remnant store.
Okay.
Now, the mill remnant store, you'll recall, is a building that sat right on Main Street, and it was set into a little alcove that had been created in the there on the Cherry Hill property.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, they lived there for many years. Now, I do not know who owns that property now, but it appears an attempt was made to improve it, but that attempt has stopped and nothing's happened.
Yeah, my understanding was that two brothers purchased the property back in the early 2000s with the hopeful intent of bringing it back to its glory, but unfortunately they actually ended up altering the exterior appearance of it considerably. And it just, I guess, was too daunting a financial task. It just didn't get very far, but it is certainly a property significant to Lenoir, and it would sure be nice if somebody would take it under its tender care.
It really doesn't face toward Main Street. It faces on the other side, and that is flanked by Vance Street, I believe.
So Vance comes up and around, and then it comes back around to the Main Street.
All right.
Yes.
On that side?
Yes.
Yeah, it's on the west side of North Main by Block.
On the other side of the remnant store, which is that around that was just a one-way there.
Conley Street is a branch off on the other side of the street, and Bellevue Cemetery, I would venture, well, no, the Bellevue Cemetery must be part of the Harper family property, or because you think that's a Finley Street. You know,
Well, Finley Academy is where the street name gets its name from. Yeah. Yeah. Anybody else? Again, thank you for your patience and your boldness in coming out. We appreciate your visiting with us. Hope you can come back often. Thank you, son. Thanks.
The inscription on the cane is presented to C.A. Cilley from J.L. Lenoir, July 1868. Please contribute to our Caldwell Heritage Museum at 112 Vaden Street, Lenoir, North Carolina, 2864.